Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, it's felt like a busy January. A lot going on in my life, and I know you've been quite busy as well, both professionally and in your personal life too. How's the new year going so far, and what's on your mind?
Well, I'm hoping and assuming that the pace will not keep up like it has for this month, because if it does, I don't know, how I'm going to make it to the other side of the year, because it's been just breakneck pace, exciting, but also, sometimes overwhelming. But already, things are beginning to resolve and a bit more clarity and a bit more grounded. Even a week from now, I move into this new cabin in the woods that I purchased, and I'm excited about that. Because I've been first I lived in a tiny cabin in the woods, in a really, really tiny cabin with no electricity. And then I've been staying in a hotel suite in Spartanburg, South Carolina for a month. And now finally getting ready to have a home base again, which is going to be the best of both worlds, I think. I'll have electricity and internet connection, but I will also be in the middle of the mountain woods. So I'm looking forward to that. And exciting times ahead.
Yeah, that's super cool. I know we've been talking about this for a long time, and I'm excited to see this come to fruition for you and what lies ahead. And it's going to be a very exciting year. So there's a lot going on at least it feels that way. There's a lot happening in the UFO topic as of late. We get the sense that more is on the way. There's a lot more coming. But, as we often do, when we're taking stock of the new information that we're absorbing, you and I talk a lot about the different kinds of models and frameworks that are quite popular in UFO history and in contemporary ufological circles, and how those models either fit the data or don't fit the data. Why people kind of seem to clump together in some of the camps and some of the other camps and changes over time as well. And so I think it'd be good for us to go through some of that together on this episode and kind of talk through some of these different narrative frameworks. And then maybe we can land on at the end of the episode whether or not those frameworks are valuable, what parts of them might be valuable, what parts of them might not be, and also just kind of where the data, as far as you can see, and I can too, sort of fits into a larger picture than maybe those frameworks themselves point to. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm excited about this because I think, one thing that's definitely within our wheelhouse in terms of what we were trained in is understanding the cultural milieu that gives birth to different narratives and different dogma sets. So there's always an interactive process there. It's never that truth comes out and it's seen. It's always that some kind of truth emerges, and then we as human beings carve that into a narrative. There's something that you might carve out, a statue from stone kind of thing. But part of that process always involves the context of the culture we're in. And so you can see that looking back at religious history, for instance, and we often draw this parallel between religious history and ufology, and even someone like Jacques Vallée has talked a lot about that. But I think it's worth, really spending some time drilling down into how that process works, the way that these different factors interact with each other, and also people's personal histories and how that plays in. I was reading some really interesting information about what makes some people more likely to believe a conspiracy theory than someone else. And I'm talking about beyond just the question of, how much data backs that particular theory, but just what is it about in general that one person is more likely to steer that way than another. And that's really interesting. And we're in an interesting time as a culture too, especially American society. We were talking about this before we went on the air, this notion of being in a post-truth world, as my friend Ken Wilber described it. And what are the implications for that, not just for the way we have beliefs about government and the way the country should be run, but even about, what these others are doing. And there's so many factors. And what's really fascinating is to pry it all apart and see how these sort of interact together.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up some concepts there that I think are important in reiterating, and that's that there are individual ways of looking at the world. There are also societal ways of looking at the world. And so if we take, the modern world that we know, that we're familiar with, you can look at the different sort of large superpowers, for example, and the way their societies are structured, the way that they function. They look at the world and have a model, an operating model that functions for them in a way. And we can obviously critique the health or the disease of that model, but within those societies, the individuals have their own models, and so we're always kind of playing with these different ideas, and I think that's important. The reason why I bring it up and just kind of want to hammer it home is that if we're dealing with a phenomenon that it has a variety of different parties, a variety of different other entities, and other groups, they're going to be subject to the same kinds of operating, sort of tendencies that we are, right? So we talked about this a little bit. When we're operating in a low information zone, we have a tendency to really flatten the model or flatten our understanding of how, quote unquote, they are. But if we're really taking an expansive view, unpacking it all, thinking through it, and we're honest with ourselves, we have to come to the place where we can say, look, there's not one agenda at play. There's not one way that these others happen to be. There's a lot of different things happening. And even within groups that might be the same group, there are a variety of different things happening. So I know we're going to come back to that a little bit as we kind of go through these different models themselves, but I think it's important that we reiterate that point.
Right. And I think, you and I were talking about how we wanted to sort of steer this episode, and we both want to, take a magnifying glass to what we believe or what we assess is going on as much as we can, but also look at some of the historical narratives and the different groups that have emerged within ufology saying a certain thing about it's really this, or another group saying, no, actually it's this, and it's like diametrically opposed about the same data set. So that's an interesting process in itself. So we want to take some time and go through each of those, talk about ways that data supports those different perspectives and maybe some ways it doesn't, and also parse out all the different factors that make people tend to believe those things or not. And then also in the end, sort of steer that to where, I sort of gather what I do about what's going on, and I want to sort of give some reasons why it looks that way to me, but also give it that magnifying glass that we're going to equally apply to these other ones as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. Well, let's get started. I think the first one that seems like the best jumping off point, if we're going to look at this in almost like a chronology, is this the model of the demons and angels, of light and dark forces. We've talked about this before on Liminal Frames, so if you've been with us from the very beginning, we've definitely spent some time looking at this model in more detail. But why, I guess, first of all, how long do you think that particular model of interaction with others, with other forces, has been at work? And then, another question I would ask is, why is that one so meaningful or powerful to those who have adopted it, not only individuals, but perhaps larger, states and organizations?
Well, we can go back and forth on this one because I think there's a few interesting points to hit. And like you say, we've discussed this before, so we want to maybe look at some different issues that we haven't addressed before. One thing I would point out that, was part of my biblical studies program was recognizing that we apply all of these anachronisms to our study of these ancient cultures and the way that they thought about these things. So we, for instance, have a certain way of viewing the world. And again, when you grow up in a society, in a civilization, you inherit those glasses and you forget that you're wearing them. And so you think it's sort of just part and parcel with truth or perceiving the world. But what happens is we then go and try to study what these ancient cultures believed about reality, and we apply the same filters as if they had the same filters we do. Of course, we do that because it's so close to our nose that we don't see it as a filter, but of course it is. So, for instance, when you look at something like the Gospels in the New Testament, some people today really wrestle over why are there these incongruencies between the different ways that it was described that Jesus went around and did certain things, and in what order, and who is he talking to, and why is some of the language different, and things. You don't have like this sort of newspaper situation where the LA Times and the New York Times, and the Chicago Tribune are all reporting on the same event, and it's all pretty much the same with just a few different words. You actually get some different constructions altogether, which makes some people from our contemporary society struggle and say, well, how can that be the same event when it's described in such different ways? But it's because their relationship with truth was different, or their relationship with this sort of sense of there being an objective stance and that a journalistic perspective should always be to try to arrive at that objectivity. That really wasn't their perspective back then. So they didn't see it as violating some sort of truth standard to kind of put some propaganda together and actually, put forward an agenda that you're trying to persuade people with. So that's an example right away off the bat of how some of the ways they looked at things were different than us. But what I will say also in terms of this angels and demons thing is that, and I want to give it back to you to give some of your thoughts, but I'll just say this, that is that we have to remember that there is raw experience and then there's interpretation of experience. And what so many people in ufology seem to miss, and even people that are, religious fundamentalists and whatnot seem to miss, is that to say that it's angels and demons just kind of begs the question, because that's an interpretive perspective on a raw event, right? Mm-hmm. There's no doubt the raw events have been happening. They're happening now and they were happening in ancient history. But to just adopt a particular interpretive perspective of that raw event just because it's older seems kind of ludicrous to me. Like, we need to actually say, let's break down to get to the raw level. And that's kind of what Jacques Vallée was really good about doing, was saying, take off the surface veneer, the interpretive layer. These events seem to, contain some remarkably similar details, similar criteria. So that says something's been going on. But we almost need to, pull out the raw experience from the interpretive grid so we can begin to move forward in a more objective way in terms of trying to figure out what is actually going on and what it means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with this one in particular too, I think we really lose sight of the fact, at least when I say we, I'm really talking about those of us in the West, that this way of thinking about the larger reality has been a part of our kind of cultural DNA for centuries, right? So this notion of the battle of good versus evil, and that there is this sort of overarching deity who's got it, who's the king of all that there is, and is marshaling these forces in opposition to the forces of darkness. I mean, all of this stuff is you can't breathe the air of Western life without it being in that air. It's just there. And the way that way of looking at the world, and the way that model has been co-opted by governments and state authority, like it's hard to ignore, right? So there's an intricate link, not only on a personal level, from this. You hear a lot about spiritual warfare, or that there's, that your soul is kind of almost like in a tug of war match between the forces of darkness and light. So not only is that happening, but there's a benefit to these states, to state power, to adopt, reinforce, and emulate the concepts that are found in this model, in this operating model of the cosmos, right? So if the king is aligned with the forces of good, and the force of good is the creator of all that there is, well, geez, like, you better not say no to the king. And the same is true for the United States and its kind of manifest destiny concept, the light on a hill. Taking all these concepts and just amplifying them to the nth degree. And so it's not hard to understand how you had folks that were working within these kind of bureaucracies and whatnot that were living and breathing this way of thinking, both implicitly and explicitly, and then encountering this kind of phenomenon, as you said, this raw experience, and then laying on top of that, well, I mean, this must be angels and demons. We're just part of this cosmic battle. It's the book of Revelation, the end times are near. Like, it's all a nice kind of packaged up little thing that works really well, not only for their own way of coping in the world, but for their states to continue doing what the state wants to do.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here, and we don't want to turn this just into a religious studies episode, but just to spend a bit more time here, I'd say a couple things. One, when you rightly pointed out that we often reduce this in the West to a battle between good and evil, I just want to point out that it wasn't always that way. And even when you look at the older traditions that gave birth to Christianity and the textual traditions that were inheritances of oral traditions that, predate Christianity, there really wasn't this stark difference of a battle between good and evil. There was, the satanic kind of figure was a member of the council of the Godhead and sort of was an agent of refining fire for the individuals that were trying to spiritually mature. And so almost like a devil's advocate. There you have that word devil, right? But in other words, it was part of the process of refining us and helping us to grow, that we were being tested basically, but testing for the greater good so that we would grow and mature. Then over time, as we in the West really embrace this black and white, dark versus light kind of dichotomy, then this Satan figure was kind of personified as this always existing or almost always existing. It was a creation of God according to this narrative, but the greatest creation of all, and it fell, and the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? And then was in battle eternally with God ever since then. So what's interesting is when I was in those circles, I remember I spent part of my many iterations in Eastern Orthodox circles, and what shocked my evangelical friends was that the Eastern Orthodox would actually pray for Satan. So they would pray that Satan would come around, kind of see the big picture again. Whereas in the West, that notion is, because again, Eastern Orthodoxy, we're talking Russia there basically. So some differences in reality perspectives, right? So in the West, we have this black and white dichotomy, good versus evil. So you can't go around praying for, personified evil. How's that going to work, right? Yeah. But from an Eastern perspective, he's just whatever, is another creation that can come around and see things from the big picture in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've been talking about Alan Watts a lot lately, and I'm reading a book that he wrote called The Two Hands of God. And one thing that he talks about in this notion of kind of the radical, sort of leaning into the force of good over against the force of evil is that at a certain point, that in order for good to prevail in the way that kind of Western Christianity has adopted, it basically has to become evil. It essentially becomes so fixated on the eradication of evil that it itself like adopts the same kinds of qualities that we attribute to evil. And so, you can see this, and not to get on a soapbox or anything of that of the sort, but when you're looking at like Western military power, for example, we're trying to be peacekeepers in the world. That's kind of the positive spin on it. But we kind of need the best. Defense is a good offense, right? So we're going to go out there, we're going to flex our muscles, and we're going to maybe do more than we need to do, and maybe push the boundaries a little bit, maybe in an uncomfortable way, but all because we, in the service of the greater good, right? So you make sort of justification for the use of force to a certain degree. So again, like just bringing all that up to say, like this is a very powerful model, a very powerful way of looking at reality, and particularly in the last several centuries, right, in the expansion of the Western world, this model has been front and center and a part of, pretty much any authority that has existed on the planet, at least in the human sense. And when you have encounters with the others come into the picture, it's very easy to understand why they got folded right into this, demons, angels conception. It's just, it was, what other way would they have thought about it, right? They had no other framework by which to approach it. And it also just buttressed what they already wanted to believe.
Right, absolutely. I think there's two key points to make there that I think will help drill it home for people. Number one, as I mentioned before, so I won't go into too much detail, you kind of have this three aspects to reality, right? You have humans and animals in the middle world kind of thing. This also shows up ironically in some versions of shamanic culture. But you have this kind of middle world where we exist with the animals. And then you have the spirit world, which is divided up into the good and the bad, right? The light and the dark, the demons and the angels, or God the Father and Satan. So yes, what happens is when you have that kind of as your working model, and you come across beings that are clearly not humans or animals from, this earth that we understand, then you go, okay, so they fall into one of these other two categories. Which one is it? Oh, some negative things are happening here. Those have got to be demons. Some good things are happening over here, even though you don't get that talked about as much. But if they do acknowledge it, they'll say, okay, so maybe that's an angel. But again, it's sort of cookie cutter fitting this vast array of phenomena with so many different phenomenological aspects to it, so many gradations, right? So much gray in there, no pun intended, that you realize that it's really doing a disservice to the data to try to chunk it into these three levels or two levels of the spirit world on top of the human animal world that we exist in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many things came to mind there just as we were talking. There's a lot of ground to cover, let's put it that way, with that particular model and why it had such staying power, right? But as looking at the 20th century and as sort of different encounters came to light, certainly stories that we've heard about in the UFO phenomena, some other theories began to emerge, and looking at those, you can see how the times were changing, right? So that model that certainly, again, which we just talked about, very, ever present, maybe still the predominant one, began to cede some of its ground, some of its explanatory power to some other models with respect to these encounters with these others. In particular, I can think of the extraterrestrial model. So that we now have not a demon per se, but an extraterrestrial from another planet, in the solar system, in the galaxy, that is coming to visit Earth. And that model, really, you can see it come to prominence with the rise of our own space program, the rise of 20th century scientism, mapping our scientific endeavors onto these entities. They must also be, scientists, explorers, astronauts just coming to visit us, right? So you can easily see why we found that model to be pretty compelling. And it also ignited the imagination at a time when we were seeing an explosion in technology and an explosion of discovery with respect to our own galaxy and solar system. So all these things really kind of coincided at just the right time. And that model began to become a lot more prominent, at least in the public imagination. Maybe, that would be different with those that were dealing with it on a personal level. We can come back to that. Maybe put a pin in that topic. Those that, maybe within the military that were dealing with it on a more intimate level, they may have still held on to that kind of demon conception. But the public at large, from the movies and the comics and the narrative, ETs were kind of everywhere. So what would you say about that, and how do you want to unpack that one?
Well, one thing I would point out right away is, again, just to help people recognize how worldviews shape our interpretation of data more so than the data does in a raw sense, is that even within religious circles that we just described, there are some differences. So the most fundamentalist groups really don't think that there's life elsewhere in the universe because the Bible doesn't literally describe it. Or you could say there's sometimes they do, but let's say for a second here that go with their notion that it doesn't really. In the same way that they question whether or not dinosaurs really existed because they're not mentioned, that kind of thing, right? Even though you have Leviathan and stuff like that. But to my point, the most fundamentalist groups don't think ETs are possible because they believe that God made the earth the center of the cosmos, and all the real important actions happening right here, and everything else kind of just serves this central stage. And so they don't see there being other planets that are just as much of a mainstay as we are in their worldview. There are other people that have more of a progressive Christian perspective, but still hold to that basic overall framework that say, okay, so now it's not just humans and animals on the earth, but it's all living biological creatures in the physical universe, right? So that middle tier now extends laterally, right, to now include other planets with other biological organisms, other kinds of animals, other kinds of, maybe even sophisticated intelligence, but they still fall within that middle zone. So again, even within these religious circles, you have these different gradations based on belief, right? So predetermined dogmatic belief then looks at the data and makes sense of the data, not the other way around.
Yeah, definitely. And just the absurdity of that idea, take, the Vatican or whatever making pronouncements about, if we discover these other entities, whatever, then they're a part of, just like you said, they're part of the middle tier. But don't ever forget that the revelation, the embodiment of everything that the church holds dear and true is still happening here on this planet, right? So it's it's crafty because it's like, yeah, you're all part of the club, but just don't forget we're still the most important. Like the revelation of all that is true happened 2,000 years ago. So it's a bit of a strange way to kind of contort the facts as you find them to fit into your narrative, but I mean, quite frankly, that's what we've always been doing, right? So we've touched on this many times, and that is that we cannot help but look at the world we find ourselves and interpret it from what we've been handed. And we're always doing that. Like there's no escaping that. And so it just so happens that some of these models have a lot of staying power, and then be very difficult to disentangle and to look at objectively if it's ever present within the society, right? But as time went by, and that ET model is certainly and still has a lot of adherence and is very compelling, and I think we've even mentioned several times that we think it's both and, right. It could be that, and it's also many other things. So keep in mind that there's a lot of different things at play here. So we're not going to discard that outright entirely. But in the 20th century, as we kind of got past World War II and Vietnam. The New Age movement was kind of taking off, and the ideas there were really, kind of lighting the imaginations of the youth of the world, and this sort of love and light conception of what these others were and were about, their agendas. That really became front and center, and we see this embodied pretty well within what we hear from someone like Stephen Greer. Like the entities are only positive. There's no negative. If it's negative, it's human, right? So I think it'd be worth taking a look at that, and why is that such a compelling way to look at it, and what are the faults with that way of thinking about it?
Right. So I think what's always interesting to do when we move on to the next perspective historically is to place it within its historical context, because these things never arise in a vacuum, right? So in the same way that, the scientific world arose out of the Catholic Church world, where Catholicism or, Christendom was dominated by a dogmatic religious perspective that gave all the power and ascribed all the power to the church, the goal of scientists and the rise of science was to say there's an objective truth that no one owns and anyone can find it by using these objective tools of analysis, in the natural world. So that's how that arose from that, but very much because it was a correction for an overswing during Christendom. Now, when you look at the New Age movement, what we see there is kind of a swinging back the other way. So you kind of go from a religious perspective that's quite closed down and has a lot of doom and gloom, you could say, and fire and brimstone, and you better do the right thing or God's going to spank you kind of thing. You don't want that, and your eternal soul could be on the line. So then we move to this scientific perspective that was, there's no such thing as an afterlife, and there are no spirits. Those are just part of our imagination, which is just an epiphenomenon of biomechanical processes in the body. In other words, it's not really real. It's just kind of what you imagine. So then the New Age movement came along and said, no, there actually is a spiritual reality, but we don't want it to be what it was before in the religious, dogmatism. We want it to be open-hearted and love and light, and you're good, and gosh darn it, people like you too. That kind of, I think of that skit from Saturday Night Live back in the day. So again, you see this correction, right? A turn based on what was perceived as an overcorrection or an overswing in a previous iteration. So it's always interesting to look at all these things within the historical context. But to that point, I think one thing we should do here is point out that, we've both talked about integral theory, and one key aspect there is to say there's truth in each of these. So one of the ways we can avoid doing these right turn and left turn 90-degree swings away and end up overcorrecting, is to say, okay, let's honestly assess the previous perspective. What was good about it? How did it move us forward? And in what ways did it perhaps miss the mark? And we can perhaps correct a little bit. So by doing those sort of more, having more minutia to how we make those incremental corrections, we tend to stay moving straight ahead. And we hopefully, learn what we can from what we've done before, but we don't reject, we transcend and include, as we say in integral circles. And so I think where we're going to land, or what's sort of just become par for the course for me, is to say, I don't reject the spiritual part. I say, how is it part of this, right? I don't reject the truths that science has taught us and ways that we can use objective analysis to make sure that we're not just, falling for our own precognitive biases kind of thing. It's important to have that part too. So we need to have all of it, bring it all in. But what I would say, one more piece before I turn it back to you, in terms of kind of the Stephen Greer kind of perspective on, really when it comes down to it, I think if you really, really press him, he might admit this, but usually what you hear is, if there's any kind of negative abduction, any kind of negative element to any kind of interaction with what is perceived as the others at all, it actually must be a government psyop. In other words, it's just reducible to human beings and our usual bad behavior, because, the love and light aliens just don't do this kind of thing. Extraterrestrials just don't operate like we humans do. And really, it's that perspective again that exists prior to the data that then changes how he looks at the data and how he makes sense of the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same sort of fallacy of looking at human civilization and going, well, we have advanced human civilization here, and because they're advanced technologically, they must also be advanced morally. And then you have, you have like the Spanish invasion of the West, where we're bringing disease and war to the peoples that were here. So there's not a lot of enlightened morality there present, even though those empires tend to think that they had that. So, it's laying onto these others the same kinds of wishful thinking, right? Another thing that we talked about related to this concept is that there's no thinking otherwise is can be quite dangerous for someone who isn't ready to think about it more broadly, right? So, if your conception is that they must only be love and light, then there's no negative or downside to it. What you're basically saying is, I refuse to believe that, because if there is a downside, I'm basically looking at my own or our own as a species, our annihilation, with no area for redemption. So love and light provides a sort of a lodestar, permanent, fixed, something to be looking forward to always tell yourself, well, it's not going to be bad. Like, they're only good, right? And because they don't have anything outside of something that would be more complex. Like, more complex would be, well, some of them are good, some of them are bad. And if some of them are bad and some of them may want our annihilation or even do cause our annihilation, what is it in the story that happens after that? And for many, the thought process just stops there. There is no after that. It's our annihilation, and it's because they live in a materialist world. Like, there is nothing else that follows. Right. So I think that we're going to come back to that, at least when we, finish this episode. But that to me seems to be a big part of this, right? It's not just wishful thinking, but it's a poverty of thinking about the model. Like, you kind of have to go this way because you don't have anything else to fall into.
Right. I think that's a great point. And I think it's absolutely correct that it puts us in a strange conundrum to think about more powerful others that might not be all positive and benevolent. And so we sort of decide we'll do the end run here and just say we're all positive, that way we don't have to deal with that, predicament. But I think another one that comes to mind for me is kind of this inferiority complex we have about our own species. I think that from my background, having some Vedantic and Buddhist background, I sort of look at it more like, we are just another iteration of the long stream of consciousness. And what is true of us is true of the evolution of consciousness across the cosmos. And so I don't see this distinct difference between, a priori, why our history and our evolution morally would be so different than other species. And in fact, I tend to think if we've gone through these iterations, they likely have as well. And because again, when it's all consciousness at the end of the day, then we're all different vantage points of this same fundamental consciousness, which is going to go through some of the same lessons. Just, by definition, that's just part of the experience of being these, temporary, illusory individuals, is that this is part of the process you go through, is you kind of become like a 5-year-old toddler that wants the world to revolve around you. Then you begin to recognize slowly that there's others as well. And it's in everyone's best interest to honor each other's wishes and try to come up with something that helps everyone. And eventually you get to the point where you realize, actually, I am everyone and they are me. And so what we want is actually fundamentally the same thing. But it takes a while to go through that. But what makes sense to me is that all of these different species across the cosmos go through that. But I think by kind of hating on humanity, being really, really judgmental of our history, rather than looking at it and saying this is an experiment in consciousness, which goes through some not great hiccups, but this is just par for the course. The same way a toddler like throws up on themselves and spoils their diaper and stuff like that, and doesn't really care if it's on the leather of the Porsche or whatever, right? I mean, this is just the way it goes. And rather than trying to judge it and say this is bad by definition, again, we talked a bit about this a bit last time, when the perspective is that we are aspects of God, we are fractal aspects of the universal mind, then we have all the freedom in the world to screw up or to grow up. And that's part of the process for all of us.
Right. And all, not just humans, but all entities, period. Right. So this process is not really complete. And I think that's often lost in our conceptions, right? We tend to think of any non-human intelligence that is we believe is superior to our own as basically having reached the top of the mountain. They're at the plateau. They don't have any further to go. They've got all the secrets, yada yada yada. But they're on their own journey, and their relationship with us is part of that journey they are on. So it's kind of a lot to wrap your mind around, but to me, it's quite compelling. I know we're going to spend some more time on it in a few minutes, but I want to spend a little bit of time here on something that you just talked about, and that's kind of the Western mind and the way that we've atomized our world, the way that we have reduced our knowledge and thinking into these sort of discrete packets of information. That knowing is, in order to know something, we have to be able to break it into its constituent pieces and chunks. And that permeates really every facet of our world, of our way of thinking in the West. It permeates our science, permeates the way that we interact with one another. Our language is atomized in the same way. And we confuse these things that we've created, these symbols and manufactured things in our environment. We've confused them for reality itself, right? And so I know we don't have to maybe go too deep on that, but I think it's important to unpack a little bit, because it's not the only way to think about reality, but it's something that we as a default tend to fixate on, and we can't. It's hard to kind of see around it. I find, it's all I've ever known, right? But now that you've introduced me to some Eastern thinking, and like it's becoming easier for me to think about knowing in a way that I'm not accustomed to, an intuitive kind of knowing.
Right, and I think this completely plays into the question of what the UFO phenomenon is, what it represents, because what we are trying to fit it within is our map, right? Not our reality, but our map of reality. And it's become so ubiquitous that we no longer distinguish between the two. So when a 4-year-old is being taught that thing over there is a thing and you call it a bird, that thing over there is a thing and it's called a cow, right? Before then, they might have just thought, this is an interesting field with some moving blue and black dots on it, right? But we're saying, no, you're thinking about it wrong. You have to itemize that. You have to split these up into objects and identify them, and this is the name you give to them. So that the process of naming itself is not just a process of naming, but it's also a conceptual framework of division, of saying these are where the borders exist in this reality, and you must think about reality this way. And one of the confounding aspects of different elements of the UFO phenomenon is they defy those, right? When they can take your consciousness but leave your body, we go, I don't think mom taught me about that when I was 5, right? There's just me, right? And so how can there be a me that on board a craft as a consciousness that's maybe dancing in spirit, you might say, with this other entity whose body is also sitting over there by the computer console while my body's lying on my bed? What does this mean for this itemized mapping of the world, right? It collapses our maps, but what we've forgotten is that what we're referring to is a map, not reality itself. And so we think it's absurd. We think it's maybe even deceptive because it doesn't make any sense. And we forget that what we're actually comparing it to is a map, not reality.
Yeah, very well said. Well, I know we have a couple more models we want to get to before we kind of turn the corner toward the end of the show. Another one that kind of came onto the scene, and here I'm thinking Skinwalker Ranch is a good example of this particular model, and that's the trickster. You see some of this not just with Skinwalker Ranch. I mean, Jacques Vallée has done a good job of sharing some anecdotes in history about this, and John Keel, of course, in Operation Trojan Horse. And I mentioned several of these. It's this illusory kind of messing with you. Jim Semivan's a great proponent of this too. And if you think about current voices that are big on this topic, you can't trust it. It's not got your best interest at heart. It's basically actively disinforming you, and so you can't really make heads or tails of it. And I find that the rise of that model is interesting, not just because, sure, it does fit some of the stories that we hear, but it also happens to coincide at a time in our history where it's difficult for us to really make heads or tails of reality in terms of, what is truth with a capital T, right? And truth in our current time is very subjective. We live in a post-truth world, some say. So being able to, put your hand on something and say, this is real, this is what it actually is, we're finding that very difficult to do, that we operate in a lot of different realities. We're kind of navigating through them. Or if you're heavily invested in social media, you've said, you know what, I'm not going to operate through a lot of them. I'm just going to encapsulate myself with one of them. And everything that I consume is just going to be a part of that one operating model. And I refuse to let anything that would be contradictory to my way of thinking permeate that bubble, right? It's a self-defense in a sense. So Trickster to me feels like it's hit the scene pretty recently, although I know there's a lot of stories in the history and the lore about trickster entities. But what are the ways that you think about that model, and what feels valid about it, and what do you think is not so valid?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I think there are different kinds of phenomena that represent different kinds of what we might call the trickster. And again, I think we err in assuming it's all one thing and grouping that together. And I think there are times where, again, not so much in Western tradition, but in Eastern tradition, there's definitely the sense that sometimes something that confounds you is in your best interest, right? In the West, we tend to go, come on, either lay it out for me or you don't. You're either for me or against me, right? That's kind of the thinking. Whereas that's not so much the thinking in the East. So you have something like a Zen koan, which is designed to stop your current kind of thinking. So it's deliberately meant to be a roadblock. It's meant to confound your thinking, not just your thought, but the way you think about reality itself is meant to be challenged, confronted. And we might say, well, that's a trickster. This is no fun. I don't know how to make sense of this. It's blowing up all my models. But that might be the very point, because your models are incorrect. So you think about someone like Carl Jung talked about, the collective unconscious and our physical reality, what we perceive and experience as the physical world that we walk around in, is actually the other side of the coin, the physical manifestation of actually processes going on in the collective unconscious. So in that sense, if we become too wedded to a certain model, for instance, reductionistic materialism, then this collective unconscious will bubble to the surface these confounding elements to try to self-correct us. So this is actually a self-correcting mechanism. But again, because we itemize and divide the world, we say this is something else against us. It's us versus them again, when it may very well be a manifestation of the collective unconscious trying to create a self-correcting mechanism that's built into the system itself. One other point I would make too is that our friend Daniel Elizondo, also known as Omega Point on Twitter, he and I recently were discussing on social media Ken Wilber again, talking about there's these different ways that we can think about truth, that there's always sort of these four different dimensions we need to think about truth. And it involves both an interior and an exterior level, both as individuals and as a collective. And if we try to collapse any of those and say that only reductionistic materialism is real, only flatland exists, the rest is mush, then that crushing of reality will create shadow, and that shadow will manifest in things that look a lot like trickster phenomena, because it's reality itself saying, you can't do that. You crush me here, I'll come up over here. That's just the nature of the beast. Part of the kind of regressive trend we've been going through as a society, I think, is because, the more progressive elements of our society just tried to crush and oppress and shame maybe the less developed parts into non-existence. But it doesn't work that way. You have to transform that energy, transmute that energy. If you don't, it will rise up again as a shadow and look confounding and look challenging. So I think sometimes, again, this trickster element can actually be for us. It's actually meant to be a self-correcting mechanism. But again, I think there's different elements here that we sometimes tend to overgroup into one.
I'm so glad you took it there. The redemptive quality of the absurd that helps broaden and deepen our understanding of what is real. We find ourselves in environments all the time that we have perfectly constructed, that don't have any margin for error, that they have tried to block out any aberration. And the absurd, as you said, finds its way in and reminds us that we are not the true masters of reality. We are just players on this scene here. And so I think that the role of the trickster is an educational one, right? It's meant to help us grow, learn, gain wisdom. In incorporating that oddity, we have to wrestle with these deeper truths and meanings that are at play, and it confronts the scope, the span of what we think we know to be true, and it humbles us, right? We are humbled in the face of that unknown, of the power of that wildness, and I think that's it's really transformative, right? At the end of the day.
Right. And again, we're back to this notion of these arbitrary lines that we draw in Western civilization. So this very thing that we say is an other, and it's a tricky other, may very well actually be ourselves, a deeper process in our own consciousness on a collective level. Like I've discussed before, this analogy of you've got the mountaintop peaks that all underlyingly join into the bedrock, and it's all the same thing, right? And it's just illusory perspectives that make us think that these are separate, really, when they actually are joined. But at that more base level of the bedrock, we don't have so much conscious awareness there. We actually have to, practice to begin to bring conscious awareness to those deep levels. But because it arises there, even though it's actually ironically coming from us, we don't recognize it as us. So then we say it's other and it must be negative. When, this is kind of what I'm getting at, is that even when you mentioned before, we still think the extraterrestrial piece is in here. It certainly is. For me, it's about transcending and including again. So it's definitely the case that beings who at some point had origins in different parts of what we perceive as a physical universe is certainly part of the picture. The reason why doesn't go far enough, though, is that it's still based on a reductionistic, materialistic model of the reality, of a physicalist model of a universe that's physical and made of stuff, matter, and that everything to do with consciousness is, again, an epiphenomenon of that underlying stuff. That, I think, is just false. It's just not true. So in that sense, they're not really extraterrestrial when we say it's just that. But they certainly have that piece. And so it's not so much about it yes or no. It's more about it's both and. It's that thing and something much more, because the very underlying model is what needs to evolve here.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's one more model that I wanted to touch on that I think has come into popular parlance lately, and that is the simulation model. And we've seen this kind of rise in the late 20th, early 21st century, popularized in things like The Matrix. Um, Rizwan Burke, in his book, The Simulation Hypothesis, is quite popular here. And it's compelling. It has a lot of explanatory power, because as we've seen our own ability to simulate reality increase through our compute power and whatnot, it's not hard for us to postulate just taking that thread forward. And I can think of Elon Musk talking about this, or Nick Bostrom, I think. So taking that thread forward, if we can do this, we can render this world in this way now, and we're continuing to make it better, then surely at some point we'll just render it to where it's indistinguishable from reality as we know it, and we'll create these simulations, and we'll be the masters of these simulations, and then we may be a simulation ourselves. It may be simulations all the way up and all the way down. So I know we've got a lot to say on that, because there are aspects of our thinking and your thinking that do use this conception to a certain degree, but it's very materialist in its way of looking at things, though, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's strange how we continually make this mistake of whatever our most cutting edge notions of what's coming next are. We tend to go, aha, so that's what the UFO phenomenon is. We talked about in the early to mid part of the 20th century, outer space was the big thing, right? Think about War of the Worlds, radio play, things like that. And so that became what we projected onto our notion of others. Now we have, virtual realities and computing power that allows us to create virtual scapes that seem very, very real. And based on the exponential explosion of, computing power, it's not hard to imagine that pretty soon we'll have something like the holodeck on Star Trek, where it's basically indistinguishable from reality. It's amazing how close it's already getting. So you scale that out, 10, 20, 50 years, and it's pretty much guaranteed we'll get there as long as we don't blow ourselves up or get wiped out by an asteroid or something. So I just think it's ironic and kind of humorous when I see people doing this. Like, even accredited scientists that are well known will say things like, oh, so some of these craft are clearly just drones, but from Alpha Centauri, right? So they sort of like take the extraterrestrial model, and they join it with our cutting edge technology, where now we've got these unmanned craft flying around the planet, and that's exciting and cutting edge. And so we go, oh, put those together, that's what these must be. But my thinking is, based on the different scales of the cosmos in terms of how long some of these other civilizations have likely been around in comparison to us, what are the chances that they just happen to be coming here with technology that's like 25 years from what we're at now, or maybe even 10 years. I mean, it's kind of preposterous when you think about it. And this speaks exactly to what we're trying to get to in this episode, which is that the models we come up with, the explanations we come up with, the way we make sense of the data, parse out the data, is always a combination of the data itself and what we bring to the table, the possibilities that we even put on the table. And I think examples like that show just how short-sighted we sometimes are.
I mean, and it's not to say that, look, hey, we may create some simulations, and we already do, right? Just not with the fidelity that we would look to and say, yeah, that's indistinguishable from my waking state. But we're not far off, and that's not to say that we won't create them, or that they don't exist somewhere, right? So again, it can be just like with the ET hypothesis, it can be part of the model, but not the model itself, right? And I think that's, the benefit here that we have is that, and I know that we tend to look at the data set of all the different things that have happened and go, man, this is confusing. Like, there's just so much different stuff going on here, and it's hard to make heads or tails of it because there's some contradictory data points here and there. So therefore, I don't know what this is. It's just, it's just, I'm going to write it all off. And we get really frustrated by that. But I think instead, by looking at all the data and saying, you know what, how do I synthesize this? How do I integrate these different experiences and anecdotes into a model that would have explanatory power for all of it, right? And can that be done? How would that be done? And that's what you and I have been trying to do. And most recently on our last episode, I think trying to lay the groundwork for the consciousness first model and why that's so important. Because as you do scale that model up, and then overlay it or intersect it with the various different phenomena that we have heard of and encountered, uh, it begins to make a lot of sense. It begins to you can see how it works together, and it's complementary. It's not sort of we have competing or antagonistic issues here that one piece of it doesn't fit the other. It all does work together, and I think it'd be worthwhile just kind of maybe traveling back through some of these models and saying, all right, well that wasn't so great, but what is your model say about what the demons and angels model, like what how would it incorporate aspects of that way of thinking into the larger picture and kind of work with the others as well.
Right, and I think you're helping me touch on something in my mind that I think would be helpful to point out to people, and that is that it may end up looking like in this consciousness first model, this consciousness being primary model, that this period of time that we're in right now, that we've been in for a few centuries, which again is just a half of a blink of an eye in the history of our species, let alone the history of the cosmos, that it's just during this period that we're in a framework where we see the manipulation of the world in terms of technology. So not only do we reduce everything to a physical world and then try to say things like our very conscious awareness is actually just a product of that, which again, as we said last time, not only is that unproven, but it's really untestable because you can't untangle your conscious experience from the environment you're in. But what I'm saying is eventually you get to the point where, because it's all consciousness, as your consciousness develops, eventually you can impact what you perceive as the physical world, which again is really just a dreamscape around you. So in the same way that, an adept lucid dreamer can control their dream, the same way, the more our consciousness develops, the more we're able to impact the dreamscape all around us, which is what we call the physical world in this current model that is, the mainstay right now with physicalism. So the notion there is that these others, when we talk about them using their consciousness to fly the craft here, and some of the most evolved ones don't even need craft. They just think it and they're here. Then they think it and they're back on Alpha Centauri or whatever. I mean, this is the nature of the dreamscape. The rules change based on your level of consciousness. And so even in, again, Buddhist and Vedantic traditions, you have, stories of yogis who were able to levitate. And in our flatland model, Western civilization, we say, those silly people, they're magical thinking. They don't know what they're talking about. But perhaps that's part of the deal, that because they really were focusing so much on consciousness and a deep development there, it's very possible that they could have developed those skills. And even if they didn't, then it's certainly the case that we will. And what we see evidenced already is that these others have already arrived at those levels. Again, like I said a couple of times ago, they want to come into your house. They don't need to open the door, open the window. They don't even need to go through the wall. They just make the wall not there. And again, it's a thought form at that point. That's how they're interacting with reality, because for them, it's a dreamscape that they can manipulate in real time.
Mm-hmm. And in that dreamscape, just to put an extra point on, we're in it. We're there. We're always in it. We inhabit it, right? So, the conceptions that we have about how it functions color, characterize, define the things that happen within it, right? And so when this phenomena occurs and intersects with those conceptions, it gets entwined with those conceptions, right? It gets sort of, think of it as like it puts on a cloak that is made of the fibers of the world that you understand, how fibers are made, right? And so it traffics in that world, and it takes on an appearance of things that that fill and populate that understanding, right? So that's why we can look at these different models over, and we can, the ones that we've explored on this episode, and we can see why, the phenomenon was so compelling and manifesting in those different ways, because that was the level of consciousness, the awareness that society had at that time, and it added laid on to these experiences, those conceptions, and how it tried to explain what it is that they were. But the reality, what they actually are, is far deeper than that, and it's something that we are only just beginning to really fully grasp. But just as we took kind of, like you said at the beginning of the episode, we kind of took the magnifying glass to some of these models. I mean, what would be the equivalent kind of analysis or magnifying glass to the model of consciousness first, and non-duality, and I know it's very compelling for us, but what are the reasons why maybe it isn't a great model, or why, or maybe maybe there aren't any good reasons. Maybe it's perfectly suitable in every way. But how do you think about that when you, I guess, are honest or try to critique it from your perspective?
Right, and I definitely think we need to. I think that sometimes, as I've said before, people will ask me how I arrived where I have tentatively arrived, and it's difficult to just sort of give them a 10-point list and say, memorize these 10 and it'll make sense to you the same way. I don't think it quite works that way. It's in many ways decades of interacting with reality, considering different models of reality, thinking about the way the transformation happens, being aware of, distinctions between, like, we were talking before we went on the air, how in many ways Eastern traditions have a fundamentally different way of thinking about reality and our relationship with it than the West. And so sometimes, Western scholars would go to the East and say, let's duel it out in a debate, your conceptions against mine. And that didn't even make any sense in those circles, because that's just not the way they think about reality. I've heard about some, lost tribes that were contacted in the Amazon that seemed to function almost like a hive mind. Like they didn't speak much. They seemed to have almost like a telepathic understanding amongst themselves. And in some ways, mirrored what we see with some of the others. And I think that's just an example that if you have a certain way of perceiving reality and then you act on that for generations and generations and generations, you end up with a fundamentally different way of being and seeing reality, and even understanding individual versus collective and things like that. So all of these factors come in here. And like I said earlier, I try to take a transcend and include rather than supersede and reject, right? Kind of perspective on these things. So I look at all of the different things we talked about: angels, demons, sort of ET scientific expeditions, things like simulation hypothesis. I take all of that and I say, how can that be part of this? Interdimensionality is another one. And how can we take all of this information and see how we can parse out the different data streams and see different patterns within the totality. And I think if you hold a wide enough aperture for all of that to be in the picture, to say that everybody's right to some degree, as Ken Wilber likes to say, then you can actually begin to see the data differently. So I think what I would posit makes this perspective compelling is that I try to use the broadest aperture possible. I try to include as many sort of truth paradigms as I can and not reject any of them, and try to have a both and perspective, saying that let me try my darndest to see if I can make this fit somewhere, rather than just saying it's not my first choice, so I'm going to reject it. So I think by doing all those things, you end up with some pretty compelling patterns that emerge amongst the totality because you've held the aperture really wide.
Yeah, and for me personally, the reason why I like it is that it takes personal experience very seriously, right? So when you have a consciousness first model, you really lean in to what is happening in experience, in awareness. You take it very, very seriously. And so, operating in a world where we have millions and billions of people all, sharing an experience. We're all sharing a collective experience together. And yes, I mean, most of the time it's pretty much the same. But when you have the outliers, when you have the strange things that enter that experience in that mix, our tendency is to go, well, that's just crazy. Like that's not the world that I'm operating in. Whenever they have seen or have experienced, like it just doesn't fit inside the confines of what is quote unquote normal or can happen, of what is possible. So instead of just rejecting those things outright, it's saying, wait a minute, all right, it's not just one person who's saying this, but it's many people who are saying this. Many people who are having an experience that looks very similar or has some very similar or shared qualities. I can't just at that point then go, I'm going to discard this. It's not, I just don't need it. I'm just going to pretend, I'm close my fingers in my ears and close my eyes. It's not there. No, it is there. It's happening in experience. And so how do I fold that into my conception of reality? So, I have to be honest with the fact that it's occurring. It is occurring. And so for me, this way of thinking, it allows me to feel more connected to my fellow human being, to all of reality itself. It makes me feel more connected not only to my conception of myself, but not myself even now, but myself in the past and the future all at once. It's truly very expansive, and I find that to be incredibly powerful and meaningful, right? And here we can talk about, because I know some will go, aha, he sounds like he's describing something that is akin to religious belief. Well, I mean, I hate to break it to you, but we all have beliefs about the world that we could look at and frame in a way that are quote unquote religious beliefs. It's just that we've landed in a place in the 21st century where religion occupies a very tiny corner of the room, and we like to kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, I don't do that stuff anymore. I live in the world of science. So it has its own compelling narrative about how things are, that if you drill down deep enough also has tenets of faith that prop it up. So, let's not get too prideful here with the way that we think. So I just wanted to take that personal detour, because I find that this way of looking at the phenomena is incredibly powerful and redemptive, and ultimately answers those deep questions of meaning that I have.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, that one of the things we're saying here is that myth making never stops being part of the process. It's not just that in the Middle Ages they made up myths and we stopped doing that when the scientific revolution rolled around. No, we have a new myth that is the dominating paradigm that we operate under. And as often the case, almost always the case, whatever the dominant paradigm is tends to forget about its own myth. It sees it as reality. Again, they've replaced the map over top of reality and have forgotten that's what's happened with that bait and switch. And I think about, like, to your point about, claiming things can't happen that are happening. When I think about there is that, these are not just outliers, they are offensive outliers. And this says something again about our pride and our hubris, which, as we've said many times on the show, we can't seem to escape as a species. So it's not just that these experiences that are being reported as real in some way are outliers, but they're offensive outliers because they challenge our paradigm. And again, according to the spirit of science, we should say, wow, great, some new data, let's dig in. Maybe we'll learn something about our paradigm that's like insufficient. That's not usually what we do. We like to believe that we've landed at the 99 percentile. And so anything that is so confounding that it would challenge the very existence, the very, supports for the paradigm that is dominant, that makes us nervous. And we tend to mock and scoff and ridicule people who would present evidence that would challenge the paradigm, unfortunately. I think about famous historic cases, like I remember this one case where these, village people and farmers were coming into the town square and reporting that fiery rocks were falling from the sky. And the powers that be said, oh, you silly, uneducated people, such things don't happen. So there was very much the same sort of idea that even though multiple people were reporting this, they said, according to our paradigm, this can't happen, so therefore it's not. Somehow you're just all experiencing a mass delusion or something. As it turns out, they went and investigated, and they found these fiery rocks, and they're called meteorites. And for the first time, that became part of our understanding that these things actually do happen. The rocks can indeed come from outer space and fall to the earth. So that was where the common folk actually challenged the paradigm and got it to change eventually. So yeah, this is important to keep in mind, that when people are having experiences over and over again that share all of these common data points, we must pay attention. If it seems like the challenge is that it seems to be happening on a level of reality that doesn't fit with our model of reality, then we should question our model of reality, not question the myriad numbers of people that are having the same experiences. I think about a couple experiences I had recently. One person online was saying to me they just didn't believe that there were non-human intelligences around. And I said to him, well, what do you do with all of the myriad people who are reporting these experiences? Not just seeing lights in the sky, but having ongoing dialogues with non-human intelligences, sometimes over decades. And he would say, well, I take them one at a time. And I said, they saw something, but I don't know what. And I stopped there. And I think to myself, number one, again, they're not just seeing something, they're having decades-long interactions and conversations sometimes. So to just write it off as they're seeing something is really not honestly dealing with the data. Number two, I think another huge part of his problem in his approach was he said he took them one at a time. And you have to look at it and go, thousands and thousands and thousands of people are reporting these experiences. And we know that still today, there's enough ridicule that most are probably still not reporting it. So this is happening on a wide scale across our planet as we speak. And it's ironically the stickiness and the rigidness of the pre-existing dominant model that prevents us from really reckoning with it, even though it's here whether we like it or not.
And imagine you don't have to imagine it, but the damage being done to those who are having to tamp down their lived experience because it doesn't fit with the consensus reality, that there's no room in that reality for what they're going through. The kind of deep trauma that is creating for that individual and for the society, right? So, individual experience is ultimately does lead and feed into the societal experience. And so, this is often how it goes, right? Societies have stumbled upon a model, a map of the territory, and they really like it. This map's really getting me places, and I can find a lot of value here, and it's I'm finding that I'm not getting lost that often, so it's pretty great. And then over time, after taking that map out and using it, and navigating around, you're starting to find, well, wait a minute, I can't. What is this right here? Was this on the map before? This is strange. And so the map begins to have less efficacy, right? It's not as useful, because the territory itself has to be wrestled with, and let's not forget the territory itself is always changing, right? And so we enter into phases, and this is what happens, in phases of development where the maps become worn and tired and threadbare. Everyone's still carrying them, but they're not as powerful anymore and not as meaningful. And so at some point, people have to look around and go, wait a minute, we've got to come up with something better here. This isn't working. And lo and behold, you find that there are those within that society at that time, and just like there are those amongst us now who are drawing their own maps. They're drawing the new maps, and those maps are becoming more powerful, more meaningful, allowing them to navigate reality in a better way than they were before. And that's what we need to champion. Now, it's just unfortunate that we don't have a place in our system for allowing that to happen in a healthy way, right? Usually the new map arises out of a lot of conflict, out of a rendering, a tearing of the old and emerging of this new. It's not, it's basically a giving birth, right? It's a violent kind of giving birth to a new model. And I fear that's really where we are headed, right? As much as we want to fight it, as much as we might want to say, I'd really love a peaceful transition to a better map where everybody kind of comes along and understands this. I don't know that's going to be the case. That it just may, in fact, be quite challenging and demanding, and there may be a lot of paradigms that are shattered in the process, and collective trauma as we wrestle with the way things are, and how our model has failed us.
Yeah, there's again, what we're opting for here is nuance, gradations, and crossing over of liminal zones where there's some interpenetration of different levels of reality. We are not rejecting these different aspects we talked about earlier, these different narratives. We're saying they do fit in, but sometimes where they fail is when they try to become absolute. So again, to use a historical example like the Collins elite, we've talked about them before and how they looked at data that they were coming across and determined that this was basically a demonic deception. And so we've talked about how there was some raw data, and then many of them had kind of a fundamentalist Christian perspective. And so it's not surprising that the way it looked from that perspective was it fit the bill of demons. Because again, if you have a small list, then whatever it fits closely to, according to that criteria, is what you're going to pick. It doesn't mean it's right. It just means that's all you had to pick from, right? But I would say, on the other hand, there are some people in this community who would say, the Collins elite, they're silly just talking about demons. We need to get past that. I'm saying, whoa, hold up there. I think there is an element here where there are nefarious interdimensional entities. Now, labeling them Christian demons and applying to that a whole narrative theology involving a bunch of dogmatic statements about the nature of reality and how they came to be, that's a separate matter. But yes, indeed, there is elements of both benevolent and not so benevolent interdimensional others that can influence us and seem to interact with our reality and our very consciousnesses in ways that confound the common contemporary physicalist paradigm. Absolutely, that's happening. And I think, again, it's a model poor situation that puts us in the predicament we're in, because we tend to go, listen, it's either angels and demons, like they used to say a couple hundred years ago, or it's modern science, and this is all, delusion or, errors in a brain that's diseased or something, or fraud, right? We reduce it to those two options because those are the models we have available. I'm saying let's creatively look to new models, ways that we can transcend and include our previous models based on what the raw experience is telling us.
Yeah, incredibly powerful. So I feel like we've covered a lot of great ground here. What is your kind of surveying the landscape of what's in front of us? And I'm talking not just about the things that have been made public, but the things that, that you're thinking about and conversations that you're having. How do you see the next weeks and months and, years ahead of us kind of unfolding? Do you think that there's going to be a continual kind of awakening to this understanding? I feel like we're seeing some signs of that, and pointing to thinkers like Donald Hoffman and, Bernard Kastrup and many others, who are starting to point in this direction. Do you see the momentum there, or do you see, sort of maybe the last kind of dying breath and gasp and grabbing at our technology as our savior, right? Particularly with the rise of these AI tools that we're all, using and hearing about. I worry that we're going to be, just sort of continually invested and wrapped up in those things, and maybe not be confronted with the ways in which our ways of thinking and models are really inadequate. And look, I like them. I mean, geez, I love the AI art tool, but I have concerns about just, is this something that's going to help us as a society, as a people, as a world, develop our way of thinking, in the direction that it needs to go.
Right. And I would sort of clarify what you said there at the end there by saying, help us in the areas where we are most in need of help, right? So AI can certainly help us increase our technological capacity, can help us comb through mountains of data and come up with intriguing insights. It will certainly do that. But is that really where we are most in need of help? And I think we would suggest no, that the problem is our underlying consciousness and our ability to become so fascinated, so titillated by these technological insights and these technological progressions actually becomes kind of the circus, right? That distracts us while our consciousness gets choked out by a lack of development and a lack of attention. And then eventually it becomes the case that we just have lost all discernment. And maybe we end up with a situation like Elon Musk describes, where we create the technology that ultimately destroys us or something like that because we're just not paying attention. Or we slowly evolve into, well, let me say it this way. It's interesting. One of the narratives that's come out that I think is absolutely legitimate is that one of the groups of others that we are interacting with kind of followed that trajectory, and they embraced more and more technology. They tried to reduce emotional awareness and emotional capacity and even emotional intelligence, and they focused on different kinds of intelligence that kind of serve technological progress. And in so doing, they lost something vital in their genetic code, basically. And part of what they're trying to do in interbreeding with us and the hybridization programs is to try to reintroduce some of that again because they have lost it. And in trying to tame the primal animal aspect of us, they also lost the ability to sexually procreate. And they ended up basically with cloning of existing beings. So they focused on hyper specializing towards a certain kind of intelligence and optimizing for that. And then they cloned those versions of those intelligences in their species. And then various other things fell by the wayside, and they ended up with a situation that was not good. And that's why they have to now take this drastic action of trying to interbreed with us in order to slowly bring this back into their basically way of being, right? And this is just a cautionary tale. I think we could go down this road too if we're not careful. If we focus again on the circus, on the pyrotechnics of technology completely divorced from consciousness, we will likely end up there. And that's a cautionary tale for us. And I would just say, as I was saying to you before we went on the air, that part of the reason why they can even hybridize with us is because I believe there is evidence for an ancient seeding program that happened across this arm of the galaxy where we have common humanoid shapes and things like that. It's not just because it's us from the future and things like that, though that's part of it, but actually that these different humanoid groups are actually all part of the same original seeding program by an intelligence in a distant history who have since moved on. And now we have many, many eons later, the different iterations of those seeding programs on different planets now interacting, some being further along than others. And that's why you have this hybridization going on. Some of it's for scientific experimentation. Some of it's kind of just a game to some of them. And to others, it's a vital aspect of trying to adjust something that's gone wrong in their, trajectory as a species. So these are cautionary tales. So when we look at these others, we don't just see otherness. Sometimes we also see a possible trajectory for our very future, and we should learn from where they went wrong if we can.
Yeah, there's a template, and then we kind of talked about not just the literal DNA, but the sort of metaphorical DNA that is at work, that the generational tendencies that are at play here. Another thing that I wanted to touch on too about the AI, and we've had conversations about this, and I think I can take a quick step back before our current technology to other older technologies. So the written word, to the tarot, for example, that for whatever reason, and this is just sort of, I guess, by the nature of how it actually works, reality actually behaves. The phenomena can manifest itself and does manifest itself in our technology. Like so it's very possible, and we're even seeing some glimpses of this in AI research. I think that it can come forward, right? It can sort of do things within that AI that we don't understand and didn't anticipate, and that may give us I don't know, insight into what it wants, or this deeper layer of reality that we aren't necessarily experiencing firsthand. So I guess what I'm trying to get at there is it could be a very positive thing, that maybe the advent of these tools could provide new avenues of interaction with aspects of the phenomena that could be helpful. What do you think about that?
I think it's absolutely possible, but I would also say that discernment is paramount here, because this is an interesting piece, because one of the things I was talking about on the latest edition of OTC Squared that I did on the weekend was this very notion of consciousness technologies, and that some things like tarot or oracle cards actually were a kind of consciousness technology. And by bringing the randomization element into the picture, the same way that you can with a random number generator, as a modern example, because again, everything is fundamentally consciousness, you allow the conscious cosmos, or different elements of it in the form of these different kinds of intelligences, to interact and play with us through these processes. So getting back to maps again, bringing this full circle to the beginning of the conversation, when we always name and categorize clinically all these different things and confuse the map for the territory, what we sometimes choke out is any ability for magic to work in the world. And by magic, I mean actually just the very real interplay of consciousnesses across the entire scope of the many, many dreamscapes that make up the entire, thought forms of the universal mind. And by using these different technologies, we actually can begin to play with some of these. And I think some of this technology is the very thing that Donald Hoffman's talking about when he says that he believes the universe is likely teeming with life, but we're just looking in the wrong places because we're looking within our interface. So I think he's right on track there. And I think these different kinds of, whether you call them occult practices or whatever, are actually early examples of this. And yes, I think AI presents to us a possibility of some profound opportunities in the future to sort of punch through our interface and actually interact with the reality that's beyond that we never up until now have had direct access to. So that's really profound. But my only caution that I would add there is that we could also end up with a situation like kind of an Aleister Crowley, where sometimes what you end up interacting with maybe isn't so safe, or maybe doesn't have your best interests at heart. Again, those lessons we talked about earlier, we have a vast array of different intelligences all walking along this progress of moral development. So the cautionary tale there is that rather than focusing all our attention on developing external technologies, we need to develop internal technologies, inner science, so that we have the discernment to know what we're tuning into. So we grow our telepathic capacity. So when we tune into an intelligence, we can tell how far along it is and whether it has our best interests at heart. That's the kind of thing I think we should focus on moving forward, for this to present the best possibilities while also mitigating some of the real challenges that might lie ahead as well.
Excellent. Well, I hope we get a chance to explore ways in which we can do that. We can promote those practices and enhance and strengthen those consciousness muscles, if you will. I know we've got some thoughts on that. Hopefully we'll have some fodder for future episodes. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. I've really enjoyed the territory that we've covered. And I know we'll be circling back to some of these concepts in the future. Exo, it's been a wild January. We're kind of coming to the end of the month. I can't believe I'm saying that. I don't know how we got through the end so quickly. But I want to wish you well on the cabin, and it's coming up next for you, and I look forward to your future manifesto from the cabin. So,
thank you. I'm excited too. And again, based on, I was jokingly saying to you, 2022 was a crazy year, and so far, based on the pace of 2023, it doesn't look like it's going to slow down. So we'll see what happens, but I'm excited about it either way.
Excellent. Well, thank you, listeners, for joining us. And we'll end as we always do. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.